Hey friends, welcome back. Class is back in session, and today I'm gonna try to fix my crazy hair. Today we're gonna do some biology, and we are gonna talk about a very important question, which is, where does alcohol even come from in the first place? And for that, I need to introduce you to our old friend and most likely the oldest domesticated animal slash single cellular fungus known to humankind, the yeast. This is basically what a yeast looks like. It's a single cellular organism. Actually looks probably more like this. Thanks, Wikipedia. So yeast is a single cellular organism that exists everywhere just naturally, exists all over the place, and it exists on fruits, it exists in the air. And so it is easy to kind of imagine how people started to discover fermentation because fruits that were sitting out in the sun or pounded grains that were sitting out were populated and started to be digested and fermented by the yeasts that were naturally occurring on them. So yeast and humankind have had a happy relationship for thousands and thousands of years, and yeast gives us alcoholic beverages. It also is what leavens bread. And without yeast, where would we even be? It would be a sad world. So in our tour at the distillery, when we talk about fermentation, because all alcoholic beverages start with fermentation, whether it is beer, whether it is wine, whether it is sake, and whether it is a distilled beverage, you still have to ferment something that has fermentable sugars in it to get alcohol. And so we boil it down at the distillery in our tour, we say yeast eats sugar and creates alcohol as a byproduct. But there's so much more, and it's so much more exciting than that when you get down to the molecular level. So let's look a little bit more closely at what is actually happening in fermentation. So most of what we make starts from grain, but you can also start from fruit. You can start from anything that has sugars available for the yeast to eat. Usually there need to be usually these sugars are in the form of starches, which are chains of sugars together, and so different enzymes need to be present. That's what happens in the malting of barley. You start to sprout the barley, and that releases enzymes which break some of the sugars down into smaller sugars, break the starches down into smaller sugars like glucose, like fructose, which can be digested by the yeast. But to get started with the process of basically making energy for itself and then making alcohol as a byproduct, the yeast has to break down the glucose further. And this process of breaking down glucose is called glycolysis. And here is my visual of glycolysis. So what's happening in glycolysis is you have your glucose ring, and the cells, and this happens in all cells because it's also the first step of cellular respiration. So what's happening is the glucose is being broken down, and this requires some enzymes, and it requires 2 NAD pluses to have hydrogens added to them, so to become 2 NADHs. And this also creates 2 ATPs, which are a cell's form of energy, plus 2 pyruvates. Now, in a cell that's doing cellular aerobic respiration, these pyruvates then go into the aerobic respiration cycle, the Krebs cycle, and create a whole bunch more ATP for the cell to use. But yeast, as well as a number of other organisms that do anaerobic respiration, don't do that process. So they need another way of getting these NADHs back to being NAD pluses so that they can keep breaking down glucose in glycolysis and making these ATPs. And so to get these pyruvates, so they use the pyruvates basically to convert NADH back to NAD plus to create this cycle. And we benefit. Woohoo, look at this. I'm so excited. excited by all of these molecules. So here we have our pyruvates. And what happens first is that pyruvate gets converted to acetaldehyde and CO2 as a byproduct. And so you can see basically how this happens. This bond is broken, this becomes a double bond. We get our CO2, and then this gets converted to acetaldehyde. And the CO2 that is a byproduct when you are baking bread, for example, the CO2 gets trapped because of the bread around it, which makes the bread rise, makes it fluffy. When you are fermenting, you'll see lots and lots of bubbling during the fermentation process, and that's all of that CO2 that is escaping the liquid. With like champagne and with beer, even after fermentation, oftentimes more yeast is added to go through this process more and create more CO2 so that there are bubbles that can be trapped inside of containers. So you get a bubbly product. Anyway, so first you have acetaldehyde and you have CO2 released. And this acetaldehyde is something that is able to accept a hydrogen from the NADH. So the acetaldehyde accepts a hydrogen from the NADH and becomes our friend ethanol and leaves NADH behind, which can go back and help yeast do more glycolysis. And then we have the ethanol as a byproduct, and ethanol is the alcohol that we drink. Cheers! So yeast will keep doing this until it either runs out of sugar or actually kills itself from the amount of alcohol that is in the liquid that is being fermented. And so yeast can't exist in conditions above about 15% alcohol, which is why you never really see things like wines with a higher alcohol level than that. So to make an alcoholic beverage that is a higher alcohol level than about 15%, then we get over to where we need chemistry in the chemistry of distillation. And distillation basically uses the fact that different molecules have different boiling points. And so in this soup, that is ethanol, but it's also a lot of water, and it is byproducts of other like messy byproducts of fermentation, because there's not just glucose and not just ethanol is being produced. So all of those things have different boiling points, and so in distillation, we are slowly heating things up, and they are boiling off at different times, and then we are capturing that steam at different temperatures and cooling it back down to liquid, and we can separate things out. Now my children are coming in from outside and clearly need some attention, so I hope you enjoyed learning how yeast actually makes alcohol as a byproduct from our friend's glycolysis and fermentation. Yay! Cheers.